In 1934, a Dust Bowl mother in Oklahoma fed a family of 7 on 38 cents a day and never once let them go to bed hungry. She did it with beans, cornmeal, and tricks passed down from women who survived worse. Every state in this country has a meal like that, a dish born from empty cupboards and stubborn love. Number 37 fed coal miners who couldn't stop working long enough to eat. Number 4 was made from the parts the butcher threw away. Number 1 carries a history most Americans never learned. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down one forgotten poor man's meal from every single state. Number 50, Georgia, the tomato sandwich. In the deep heat of a Georgia August, when the garden gave more tomatoes than any family could eat and money for meat had run dry, supper was a tomato sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a thick swipe of mayonnaise on both, a tomato picked warm off the vine, sliced fat, salted and peppered until the juice ran down your wrist. That was the whole meal. There was no cooking, no stove, no dishes to speak of. In the 1930s and 40s, a working family in South Georgia could grow a summer's worth of tomatoes off a few cents of seed, and the bread cost a dime a loaf. What made it a real supper, and not just a snack, was the ritual of it, eaten standing over the sink so the drippings would not stain your shirt. People who grew up on these will tell you a store-bought winter tomato has never once tasted right. The magic was the warmth of the sun still inside the fruit. Restaurants now charge $8 for the same thing and call it heirloom. Georgia called it Tuesday. Number 49, Arkansas, chocolate gravy and biscuits. This one sounds like a child's fever dream, but for generations of Ozark families it was breakfast, and often it was supper too. Cocoa powder, sugar, flour, and a little salt whisked into milk in a cast iron skillet, cooked low until it thickened into a glossy brown gravy. Then you split open a hot biscuit, laid it open-faced on the plate, and drowned it. The gravy soaked into the biscuit until the whole thing went soft and dark and sweet. It cost almost nothing. Cocoa was a few pennies a tin. Flour and lard came out of the same big sack that made every other meal in the house. In the hills of Arkansas and the Missouri Ozarks, chocolate gravy was how a poor family gave their children something that felt like a treat when there was no money for anything else. It filled bellies, it warmed a cold morning, and it made kids feel spoiled on a budget of nickels. Most Americans have never heard of it. Ask anyone from a holler in Arkansas, and their whole face will change. Number 48, Connecticut. The New England boiled dinner. Up in Yankee New England, thrift was practically a religion, and the boiled dinner was its Sunday sermon. A cheap cut of corned beef, the brisket nobody wanted, went into a big pot of water and simmered low for hours until the tough meat surrendered. Then in went the cheapest things the root cellar had: cabbage, potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, everything cooked in the same salty broth in one pot on one burner. By evening, the whole house smelled like steam and cabbage, and a single tough 2-pound cut of beef fed a family of 6 with leftovers for hash the next morning. Corned beef was cheap precisely because curing it was how you saved meat before refrigeration was common. A Connecticut mill family could feed everyone for well under $1 and use the leftover broth as the base for tomorrow's soup. Nothing went out with the trash. The vegetables absorbed the salt and the beef flavor until even a plain turnip tasted like something worth eating. It was plain, it was gray, and it kept New England alive through 100 hard winters. Number 47, Iowa, the loose meat sandwich. Iowa took a pound of ground beef and figured out how to make it feed a crowd without ever forming a single patty. You browned the beef loose in a skillet, crumbled fine, seasoned with just onion, salt, and a splash of water, and simmered it until it was tender and juicy. Then you spooned it onto a soft hamburger bun with mustard, pickle, and raw onion. It looked like a sloppy Joe's shy cousin. No tomato, no sweetness, just seasoned beef. The genius was economics. Loose, crumbled beef stretched further than a patty ever could, and the juices soaked into the bun instead of dripping into a fire. A pound of ground beef in the 1930s ran maybe 15 cents, and loose meat let a diner or a mother turn that pound into 5 or 6 sandwiches. Iowa diners built their whole identity on it, serving it wrapped in wax paper across a counter. You ate it with a spoon standing by because half of it fell out the back. Nobody outside the Midwest quite understands it. Iowans would not trade it for anything. Number 46, Florida. Smoked mullet and grits. Long before Florida was condos and theme parks, it was fishing shacks and cracker cabins, and the poor man's protein swam right up to the dock. Mullet was a trash fish, so cheap it was nearly free, and coastal families smoked it over buttonwood and oak until the oily flesh turned golden and firm. You flaked that smoked mullet over a bowl of hot stone-ground grits with a knob of whatever fat you had, and that was supper on the Gulf Coast for 100 years. The grits cost pennies a pound, and the fish cost the time it took to throw a cast net off the seawall. The smoke gave the whole bowl a richness that a poor kitchen could never have bought. Fish camps up and down the coast lived on this. Old Florida crackers ate it for breakfast, dinner, and everything in between. Today, mullet has been rebranded on menus and smoked fish dip sells for a premium at every marina. But the working families of the Florida coast were pulling supper out of the water for free, while the tourists drove past looking for a steakhouse. Number 45, Idaho, spud nuts, the potato donut. Idaho had one thing in abundance, and that thing was potatoes. So Idaho learned to put potatoes into everything, including dessert. A spudnut was a donut made with mashed potato worked into the dough. The starch made the donut lighter, moister, and slower to go stale than a plain flour donut, which mattered enormously when you were feeding a hungry family off leftovers. Cold mashed potatoes from last night's supper became this morning's treat. Fried in lard, rolled in sugar while still warm, spud nuts stretched a little flour a very long way and turned a humble tuber into something children lined up for. In a state where a 100-pound sack of potatoes cost less than a movie ticket, this was frugality dressed up as celebration. Farm wives made them by the dozen during harvest to feed the crews. The potato in the dough is invisible. You would never taste it, but you would feel it in that soft, pillowy chew. It was the perfect expression of the Idaho spirit. Waste nothing. And if all you have is potatoes, make magic out of potatoes. Number 44, New Jersey, peppers and eggs. In the immigrant neighborhoods of Newark and Trenton, the lunch pail of a working Italian man very often held a peppers and egg sandwich, and it was a small miracle of thrift. Green bell peppers, cheap and plentiful all summer, sliced thin and fried soft in a little olive oil, then eggs cracked right into the pan and scrambled through. Piled onto a torn hunk of Italian bread, it made a hot, filling, protein-rich meal for the price of a couple of eggs and a pepper. During Lent, when meat was forbidden on Fridays, it fed entire parishes. But it was really an everyday food, made cold the night before and eaten at noon on a construction site or a factory floor. The bread soaked up the egg and the sweet pepper oil until every bite held together. A dozen eggs cost a quarter, and a pepper was a nickel, so a man could feed himself for the whole workday on pocket change. It never made it onto a fancy menu because there was nothing fancy about it. It was the fuel that built the cities of the Northeast. Number 43, Kansas, egg gravy over biscuits. Out on the wheat plains, when even sausage or bacon was a luxury the pantry could not spare, Kansas farm wives made gravy out of almost nothing. This was poverty gravy, sometimes called egg gravy. You melted a spoonful of lard or bacon grease in a skillet, whisked in flour to make a paste, then added milk and a beaten egg, stirring until it thickened into a rich, pale sauce. The egg gave it body and a little protein where meat could not be found. poured thick over hot biscuits, it turned a plate of plain bread into a hot, satisfying supper. During the Depression and the Dust Bowl years, when the wheat crop failed and the topsoil blew away, this gravy kept Kansas families from going to bed on empty stomachs. The ingredients were the last things left in any kitchen. Flour, a little fat, milk from the cow, 1 egg from the hen. It cost almost nothing to make, and it tasted like far more than it was. Farmers ate it before dawn and rode out to fields that were slowly turning to dust, and it was the thing that got them there. Number 42, Oregon, fried smelt. Every spring, the smelt ran up the rivers of the Pacific Northwest in silver rivers of their own, so thick that a person could dip a bucket and pull out supper. In Oregon, these little fish were the poor man's feast, rolled whole in seasoned cornmeal, heads, tails, and all, and fried in hot oil until they were crisp enough to eat bones and everything. Smelt were nearly free food that fed river towns for generations. During the runs, whole communities lined the banks with nets, and families that had almost no money suddenly had crates of fresh fish. You fried them by the dozen and ate them like potato chips, hot and salty and crunchy. What made them valuable was more than the price. Those tiny fish, eaten whole, delivered calcium and protein that a poor diet badly needed. The same reason canned sardines mattered so much in the same era. Oregonians packed away smelt smoked and salted to last past the run. The rivers gave freely to anyone willing to stand in the cold water with a net. And for the working families of the Northwest, that generosity was the difference between lean and hungry. Number 41, Alabama, cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. This is maybe the humblest supper on the entire list, and for millions of Southerners, it was the taste of home. You took a wedge of cold leftover cornbread, crumbled it into a tall glass or a bowl, and poured cold buttermilk over the top until it was soaked through. Then you ate it with a spoon, like cereal, on the back porch in the evening heat. That was the whole meal. In rural Alabama and across the Black Belt, cornbread and buttermilk was what appeared on the nights when the meat ran out and payday was still days away. Cornmeal was cheap. Buttermilk was the leftover from churning your own butter, so it cost the family essentially nothing. The tang of the buttermilk against the sweet crumble of the cornbread was comforting in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who did not grow up on it. Field hands ate it to cool down after a day in the sun, and children ate it because their grandparents did. It was food stripped down to its absolute bones, and somehow, for the people who ate it, it was perfect. Here is where the pattern breaks, and where the real story starts to show itself. Notice what these meals have in common. Not one of them came from a recipe card. They came from mothers and grandmothers who could look at a bare cupboard and see a supper anyway. That skill, the ability to feed people from almost nothing, was the single most valuable thing a person could know how to do in hard times, and it was passed down hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, never written down because everyone already knew it. When the country got rich after the war and the supermarkets filled up, we stopped needing that skill, and within a single generation, we let it die. The families who ate these meals did not think they were being clever or thrifty. They were surviving. And the fact that they made survival taste like love is the whole reason we should remember them. Number 40, Michigan, the Cornish pasty. Deep in the copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a man could not exactly stop for a sit-down lunch 1,000 feet underground. So the Cornish immigrants who worked those mines brought a portable meal that was practically designed for it. The pasty, a half-moon of sturdy pastry, crimped along one edge into a thick rope of crust, filled with diced potato, rutabaga, onion, and whatever cheap scraps of beef the family could afford. The whole thing was baked into a self-contained meal you could hold in one dirty hand. That thick crimped edge was a handle, meant to be gripped and then thrown away so a miner would not eat with hands covered in arsenic and rock dust. Wrapped in cloth, a warm pasty could be tucked against the body and stay hot for hours down in the shaft. A single pasty was cheap to make, mostly root vegetables with just a little meat, and it delivered a full hot meal in the middle of a brutal shift. Michigan adopted it so completely that entire towns still run on pasties today. It was engineering as much as cooking, a whole dinner you could carry into a hole in the ground. Number 39, Louisiana. Couche couche. Before Louisiana meant restaurants and celebrity chefs, Cajun families in the Bayou country ate couch couche, a fried cornmeal breakfast that doubled as supper when times were tight. You mixed cornmeal with salt and a little baking powder and water into a batter, poured it into a black iron pot with hot oil, and let a crust form on the bottom. Then you stirred and scraped and stirred until the whole thing broke into crumbly, crispy, golden bits. Poured into a bowl with milk and cane syrup or a little sugar. It was warm, filling, and cost only what a handful of cornmeal cost, which was almost nothing. Cajun families were often land-rich and cash-poor, working small farms in the wet country, and couch fed the children before school and the men before a day in the fields. The crispy bottom scrapings were the prize everyone fought over. It was the Cajun answer to a bowl of cereal, decades before boxed cereal reached the bayou, and it fed generations of families who had cornmeal and syrup and not much else. Simple, cheap, and gone from most Louisiana kitchens now. Number 38, Rhode Island. Johnny cakes. Rhode Island is a small state with a fierce loyalty to one very old, very plain food, the Johnny cake. It is nothing but stone-ground cornmeal, a little salt, and boiling water or milk, stirred into a thick batter, and dropped onto a hot, greased griddle until it forms a crisp brown crust around a creamy middle. The recipe goes back to the colonial poor, and further back to the Narragansett people who taught it to the settlers. For families with nothing but a bag of cornmeal, a Johnny cake was a whole meal, eaten with a smear of butter, a drizzle of molasses, or just plain and hot off the griddle. Cornmeal was the cheapest grain a New England family could buy, so a Johnny cake supper cost mere pennies. The debate over whether they should be thin or thick has literally divided the state for 200 years. What matters is that this was survival food, the same batter a poor farmer ate in 1750 and a poor mill worker ate in 1930. It is one of the oldest continuously eaten poor man's meals in America, and Rhode Islanders still guard the recipe like a birthright. Number 37, West Virginia. The pepperoni roll. This is the meal that fed the coal miners, and it is a small masterpiece of poverty engineering. In the mining camps of West Virginia, an Italian immigrant baker figured out that a miner needed a lunch that would not spoil in a hot mine with no refrigeration, and that he could eat without stopping work. So he baked sticks of pepperoni right inside a soft bread roll. As the roll baked, the pepperoni released its spiced orange grease into the dough, keeping it moist and flavorful for a whole day underground. The salt and fat in the cured meat meant it kept perfectly without a cooler. A miner could pull one out of his pocket with black hands and eat a satisfying, filling meal in the dark without a plate or a fork. It cost the price of a little cheap bread and a stick of pepperoni, and it delivered fat, salt, and calories to men doing some of the hardest labor in the country. The pepperoni roll is still the unofficial state food of West Virginia. It was born in the coal camps, and it fed the men who lit the country. Number 36, Maryland. Coddies. In Baltimore during the lean years, a nickel could buy you a coddy off the counter of a corner drugstore or candy shop, and for a lot of working people, that nickel was lunch. A coddy was a little fried cake of mashed potato and salt cod, bound with a cracker and an egg, seasoned and fried golden. It was sold slapped between two saltine crackers with a stripe of yellow mustard, and you ate it standing on the sidewalk. Salt cod was one of the cheapest proteins in the country, a preserved fish that lasted forever, and stretching it with potato and cracker meant a whole batch cost almost nothing to make. For working Baltimoreans, especially in the immigrant and Jewish neighborhoods, the coddy was the definition of an affordable meal, filling and hot for a single coin. It was city poverty food, sold in 1,000 little shops that are all gone now. Most people under 60 in Maryland have never even tasted one. But there was a time when the whole city ran on these little cod cakes, eaten between crackers on a busy street, for the price of pocket change. Number 35. Ohio. City chicken. Here is the cruelest joke in the whole poverty pantry, and Ohio and the industrial Midwest made it into a beloved dish. During the Depression, chicken was actually expensive, more expensive than pork or veal scraps, because a laying hen was worth more alive than dead. So thrifty families took cheap cubes of pork and veal, skewered them on a stick to mimic the shape of a drumstick, breaded them, and fried and baked them. They called it city chicken, a wistful little joke about eating like you could afford poultry when you could not. The stick was the punchline, and also the handle. Breaded and browned, then baked slow until tender, city chicken tasted rich and satisfying, and it turned the cheapest odds and ends the butcher had into something that looked, on the plate, like a real Sunday dinner. It let a struggling family serve a proud-looking meal to guests without admitting how little it cost. The irony is that today those scrap cuts are not always cheap, and actual chicken is the budget meat. But city chicken survives in Ohio and western Pennsylvania as a memory of the years when the joke was the only way to laugh at going without. Number 34. Minnesota. Tater tot hottish. In Minnesota, the word for a casserole is hottish, and the hottish is the beating heart of Lutheran church basement thrift cooking. The classic is layered in one pan. A pound of ground beef on the bottom, a can of cream of mushroom soup poured over, maybe a can of green beans or corn, and then the whole top blanketed with frozen tater tots lined up like little soldiers, baked until the tots turn crisp and gold and the soup bubbles up around the edges. It fed church suppers, funerals, and hockey teams for pennies a serving. The cream soup was the magic, the cheap binder that made everything creamy and familiar, and the ground beef stretched across a whole 9x13 pan to feed a dozen people. A Minnesota mother could assemble it in 10 minutes and slide it in the oven while she did chores. It was cheap, it was forgiving, and it made a small amount of meat feed a whole crowd of hungry kids. Nobody in Minnesota is embarrassed by hottish. They are proud of it, because it is the food of getting through the long winter together on whatever the pantry held. Number 33, New York. Poor man's spaghetti, aglio e olio. In the crowded tenements of New York, Italian immigrant families who counted every penny still ate like kings, and their secret was spaghetti with garlic and oil. Aglio e olio is just that, spaghetti tossed with olive oil in which sliced garlic has been gently browned. A pinch of salt, maybe a shake of red pepper flakes, and a little parsley if you had it. That is the entire dish, and it was often the meal on the nights before payday when there was no money for sauce, let alone meat. A box of pasta was cheap, a head of garlic was cheaper, and a family could eat a hot, fragrant, satisfying dinner for a dime. The garlic perfumed the whole apartment building, drifting down the air shafts. Poor as it was, made well, it was genuinely delicious. The pasta glossy and slick, the garlic sweet and toasty. This is the meal that grandmothers made when the cupboard was nearly bare, and it is now a beloved dish in restaurants that charge $20 for a plate of noodles and oil. In the tenements, it simply meant you would not go hungry tonight. Number 32, North Carolina. Livermush and eggs. In the Piedmont of North Carolina, livermush is a point of regional pride and one of the great examples of using every scrap of the hog. When a family killed a pig, the liver and head parts were too valuable to waste, so they cooked them down, ground them fine, mixed the meat with cornmeal and sage and black pepper, and pressed it into a loaf. Sliced and fried in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and mahogany, livermush was breakfast and supper for generations. A slice fried alongside a couple of eggs, or laid on white bread with mustard, made a cheap, filling, protein-heavy meal from the parts of the animal nobody else wanted. Liver is packed with iron and vitamins, so poor families eating liver mush were getting nutrition that money could not have bought them in any other form. It cost almost nothing because it was made from the leftovers of the leftovers. Outside of a few counties in North Carolina, most Americans have never heard of it and would flinch at the name. In those counties, it is served with pride, a taste of a time when a family made a whole animal feed them through the winter. Number 31. Nevada, Basque chorizo and beans. Up in the high desert of Nevada, the sheep herders were Basque immigrants from the mountains of Spain, and they brought a hearty, cheap food that fed them through long, lonely months on the range. A pot of beans simmered slow with a link of spicy chorizo, an onion, and whatever else was in the wagon, cooked over a fire until the beans were creamy and the whole pot glowed orange with paprika grease from the sausage. It was the perfect herder's meal. A little cured sausage flavored an enormous pot of cheap dried beans, and the whole thing could sit on a fire and simmer while a man tended his flock. In the Basque boarding houses of Elko and Winnemucca, where herders stayed between jobs, this beans and chorizo was served family-style at long tables, endless and cheap and filling. The chorizo did the same work the ham hock did in the South, one cheap piece of preserved meat giving its soul to a pot of beans that cost pennies. It kept a lonely, hard-working population fed and warm, and it remains one of the most distinctive regional poor man's meals in the American West. Second pattern break, and this one is worth stopping on. Look at how many of these meals lean on one cheap piece of preserved or cured meat to flavor a whole pot of something cheaper. The ham hock, the salt pork, the chorizo, the smoked sausage, the pepperoni. This was not an accident. Our great-grandparents understood, without ever reading a nutrition label, that fat and salt and smoke could transform a bland pot of beans or greens into something a person actually wanted to eat, and that a tiny amount of meat could flavor an enormous amount of cheap food. That is the entire architecture of poverty cooking in America. One good bone, one cheap sausage, one strip of cured fat stretched across a whole family, across a whole week. The food industry later sold us the opposite idea, that we each needed a big piece of meat on our own plate every single night. That change made a lot of companies rich, and it made a lot of families poorer, and it made almost all of us forget how far a single ham hock used to go. Number 30. Kentucky, burgoo. Burgoo is Kentucky's great community poverty stew, a thick, murky, long-simmered pot that could clean out a whole kitchen and feed a whole church at the same time. Traditionally, it was made from whatever meat was cheap or free, often game, mutton, or the tough scraps other people would not buy. Cooked for many hours with corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and any vegetable on hand until everything melted into a rich brown stew you could stand a spoon up in. It was cooked in enormous iron kettles for barbecues, political rallies, and church fundraisers, feeding hundreds for the cost of a few tough cuts and a garden's worth of vegetables. The long, slow cooking broke down the cheapest, toughest meat into something tender and deeply flavored. Every burgoo was different because every burgoo used whatever the community had. And that was the point. It was a meal built entirely out of surplus and scraps and generosity. A single kettle stretched a little meat across an entire crowd. Kentucky still makes it for big gatherings, but the everyday burgoo, the one a family made from a squirrel and a garden, has almost entirely disappeared. Number 29. Wisconsin, booyah. Up in Wisconsin and the surrounding North Country, the community version of a clean-out-the-kitchen stew is called booyah, and it is cooked in kettles so large they are practically cauldrons. Chicken, sometimes a little beef or pork, simmered for a whole day with cabbage, carrots, onions, peas, and whatever else could be gathered, cooked down until it was thick and golden and rich. Booyah was a social event as much as a meal, cooked overnight by a crew of men tending the fire, made to feed hundreds of people at a church picnic. or a fundraiser for the price of a few birds and a mountain of cheap vegetables. The genius was in the numbers. Split across 300 bowls, the cost per person was almost nothing, and everyone went home full. The Belgian and Walloon immigrants who settled the region brought the tradition, and it became the way a poor rural community fed itself in celebration. It turned scarcity into a party. Making a giant kettle of booyah was how you fed everyone you knew when no single family could have afforded to. Wisconsin still holds booyah cook-offs, keeping alive a food born from the arithmetic of feeding a crowd on next to nothing. Number 28, Colorado, Slumgullion. In the mining camps high in the Colorado Rockies, a miner came off a brutal shift wanting something hot, filling, and cheap. And what he got was slumgullion. It was a loose, watery stew of whatever the camp cook had. Usually a little cheap meat, potatoes, onions, canned tomatoes, and sometimes macaroni or rice to bulk it out, all simmered together in one big pot. The name itself became a byword for any thrown-together stew, and the whole point was that it could be made from almost nothing and stretched to feed a mess of hungry men. A camp cook could keep a pot going all day, adding water and scraps as men rotated in from the shafts. The meat was minimal, the filler was everything, and the hot broth did the work of making a man feel fed. It cost the mining company almost nothing to keep a crew going on slumgullion, and it kept the miners on their feet through the thin mountain air and the endless cold. There is even a mountain pass in Colorado named for it. It was never good exactly, but it was hot and it was there, and in a mining camp that was enough. Number 27, Texas, Frito pie. Texas took a bag of corn chips and turned it into a full meal, and the Frito pie is one of the most gloriously unpretentious foods this country ever invented. You split open a bag of Fritos, ladled hot chili right into the bag, and topped it with a handful of shredded cheese and diced onion. You ate it with a plastic fork straight out of the bag. No plate, no dishes. During the Depression and after, when the Frito Company was based in Texas and chili was the cheapest hot meal a cook could stretch, this became a staple at ball games, school cafeterias, and gas station counters across the state. A little chili went a long way when it was cushioned by a whole bag of corn chips, and the cost of feeding a hungry kid was pocket change. The chili softened the chips, the cheese melted into the whole mess, and the onion gave it a bite. It was portable, cheap, and satisfying in a way that felt almost decadent for how little it cost. Texans still argue about the one true way to build one. It remains proof that America could make a beloved meal out of a snack and a can of chili. Number 26, Delaware, Slippery Pot Pie. Do not let the name fool you, because in Delaware and Pennsylvania Dutch country, pot pie has no crust and no pie tin at all. Slippery pot pie is a thick, comforting stew of square noodles, rolled thin and cut by hand, dropped into a rich broth with potatoes and whatever cheap meat was around, usually chicken backs and necks or a bit of ham. The noodles cook right in the broth and turn slippery and soft, thickening the whole pot with their starch until it is a hearty, dumpling-like stew. It was Sunday supper thrift, a way to make a few bony scraps of meat and a little flour feed a whole family. The homemade noodles cost only flour and an egg, and they did the work of stretching a thin broth into a filling meal. Every farm family had their own way of rolling and cutting the squares, and the whole kitchen would be dusted with flour on cooking day. It was warm, it was cheap, and it filled the corners of a hungry belly on a cold Delaware night. Most people picture a crusted pie when they hear the words. In this part of the country, pot pie means a bowl of slippery noodles and a memory of Sunday. Number 25, Nebraska, the Runza. Nebraska loves the Runza so much it has restaurants named for it, and the humble bierock is a masterpiece of immigrant thrift. Volga German immigrants brought a stuffed bread pocket filled with ground beef, cabbage, and onion, all baked inside a soft yeast dough. It was the same idea as the Cornish pasty, a portable, sealed, handheld meal, but seasoned with the cabbage and onion of the German-Russian table. Cabbage was one of the cheapest and longest-keeping vegetables a Plains family could grow, and mixing it into a little ground beef stretched the meat across many more mouths, all wrapped up in cheap bread dough. A farm wife could bake a whole tray of them and send the men out to the fields with a warm, complete meal in each pocket. The bread kept the filling warm and required no plate or fork. It cost only cabbage, a little beef, flour, and yeast, and it fed the harvest crews of the whole state. Nebraska adopted it as its own so completely that most people there have no idea it crossed an ocean twice. It is the taste of the plains, born on the steppes of Russia and perfected in a Nebraska farm kitchen. Number 24, Montana, beef heart and gravy. On a Montana ranch, when a beef was butchered, nothing was wasted, and the organ meats fed the family while the good cuts were sold or saved. Beef heart was one of the cheapest, toughest, and most nourishing pieces of the whole animal, and ranch cooks knew how to make it delicious. Sliced thin or ground, sometimes stuffed and roasted, the heart was cooked slow with onions until it was tender, then served in its own rich brown gravy over potatoes or bread. Heart is a lean, hard-working muscle packed with iron and protein, and a single one fed a ranch family for very little because organ meat was nearly worthless at market. The long, slow cooking transformed a tough, cheap cut into something savory and satisfying. For homestead and ranch families miles from any store, eating the whole animal was not a choice. It was survival, and they got very good at making the humble parts taste rich. Beef heart in gravy was hearty, deeply flavored, and free in a way a steak never was. Modern nutritionists now praise organ meats as some of the most nutrient-dense food a person can eat. Montana ranch families were doing it a century ago because throwing away good meat was unthinkable. Number 23, Missouri, the fried brain sandwich. In Old St. Louis, the fried brain sandwich was a genuine working-class delicacy, sold in taverns along the river for a nickel or a dime. Calf or hog brains, one of the cheapest and most perishable parts of a butchered animal, were battered and deep-fried until crisp on the outside and custard soft within, then piled onto sliced bread with mustard, onions, and pickles. For the German and immigrant butchers and brewery workers of the city, it was a rich, filling, cheap meal built from a part of the animal most people would not touch. Brains were nearly free at the butcher counter because they spoiled so fast and squeamish customers avoided them, which meant a poor man could eat like he was getting away with something. Fried up hot, they were creamy and mild and satisfying. The brain sandwich was a proud St. Louis institution for decades, a taste of a time when a working city ate every part of the animal and turned the parts nobody wanted into a beloved local specialty. A few old taverns still serve it, but changes in how meat is processed made brains hard to get, and a whole tradition of cheap, nose-to-tail eating quietly faded away. Number 22, Washington, razor clam chowder. On the wild Pacific beaches of Washington, the razor clam was there for the digging, free food for any family willing to go out into the cold surf with a shovel at low tide. Those clams became a chowder that fed coastal families for pennies. Chopped razor clams, simmered with diced potatoes, onion, a little bacon or salt pork for flavor, and milk poured in at the end to make it creamy. The clams were free, dug by the bucket in season, and the rest of the pot was the cheapest things a kitchen held. What the clams added was a sweet, briny richness that made the whole pot taste like far more than potatoes and milk. Digging razor clams was a family event, everyone out on the dark sand with lanterns, and the reward was days of chowder afterward. For working families on the coast, this was protein pulled straight out of the beach, costing only the effort and the cold. A bowl of razor clam chowder was a warm, filling supper, built almost entirely from what the ocean gave for free. It fed the coast through hard times, and it is still one of the great humble pleasures of the Washington shore. Number 21. Virginia. Fried oysters and crackers. It is hard to imagine now, but there was a time when Chesapeake Bay oysters were so wildly abundant that they were poor man's food, shoveled up by the millions and sold for almost nothing. In Virginia, that meant fried oysters were a cheap, everyday meal for the families near the water. Shucked oysters rolled in cornmeal or cracker crumbs and fried in hot fat until golden and crisp, then eaten with saltine crackers and a little hot sauce or vinegar. The Bay gave up oysters in such quantity that a working family could eat them by the dozen for the price of a little cornmeal and grease. Fried up, they were rich and briny and filling, a protein-heavy supper that cost next to nothing when the oyster boats were bringing in more than the markets could sell. The crackers stretched the meal and soaked up the drippings. For generations, oysters were the food of the poor along the Chesapeake, not the luxury they became once the beds were over-harvested and the supply collapsed. Virginia families ate like royalty on a shellfish that has since priced itself off most tables entirely. The Bay's bounty was, for a while, the cheapest supper around. Third pattern. Break, because you have probably noticed something uncomfortable by now. A lot of the foods on this list were cheap because they came from the water, the woods, or the animal in ways that are simply gone. Free oysters by the bushel, rivers so thick with fish you could dip a bucket, beaches full of clams, whole animals butchered at home and used down to the brain and the heart. That world where a poor family could feed itself off the land and the water and its own hard work has been fenced off, regulated, overfished, and priced out of reach. The independence those meals represented, the ability to feed your family without needing much money at all, was quietly taken away and replaced with a trip to the store. We did not just lose recipes, we lost a whole way of living, where being poor did not have to mean being hungry, because the country itself was still generous enough to feed you. Number 20. Pennsylvania. Schnitz und Nepp. The Pennsylvania Dutch had a genius for making a little go a very long way, and Schnitz und Nepp is one of their finest examples. The name means apples and buttons, and it is exactly that. Dried apples, the schnitz, simmered slow with a small ham hock or a cheap piece of cured ham until the fruit plumped up and the whole pot turned sweet and smoky. Then dumplings, the nepp, were dropped on top to steam until fluffy. It was a whole meal from three humble things: dried fruit that kept all winter, a scrap of cheap salted ham, and a little flour for the dumplings. Drying apples in the fall meant a family had cheap sweetness to draw on all through the cold months, and a single ham hock flavored the entire pot. The combination of sweet apple, salty ham, and soft dumpling was hearty and comforting, a Sunday supper that cost almost nothing. It fed farm families through the long Pennsylvania winters on the stored bounty of the fall harvest. It is a dish built entirely around preservation and thrift, the whole philosophy of Pennsylvania Dutch cooking in one steaming pot. Number 19. Vermont. Hasty pudding with maple. In Vermont, the cheapest supper in the house met the one sweetener the state had in endless supply, and the result was hasty pudding. It was nothing more than cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water, or milk until it thickened into a smooth, hot porridge, then sweetened with a pour of the family's own maple syrup. That was the entire meal, and for generations of Vermont farm families it was breakfast, and just as often supper when money was thin. Cornmeal was among the cheapest things a kitchen could stock, and the maple came off the family's own trees each spring, so a bowl of hasty pudding cost essentially nothing but the wood to keep the fire going. The corn mush was filling and warm, and the maple turned it from survival food into something a child looked forward to. Leftover pudding was sliced cold the next morning and fried in a little fat, a whole second meal from the same pot. In a state where the winters were long and the cash was short, this simple bowl of cornmeal and maple kept families fed and comforted. It is one of the oldest poor man's meals in New England, and it tasted like the Vermont woods themselves. Number 18. New Mexico. Pozole. In New Mexico, pozole is both a poverty food and a celebration food, and that double life is the whole story of the dish. Dried hominy, corn treated with lime until the kernels puff up, was simmered for hours with the cheapest scraps of pork, a little garlic and onion, and a good measure of dried red chili until the whole pot turned deep and rich. The corn and a small amount of pork stretched into a huge pot that could feed a big family for days, and dried hominy and dried chili cost very little and kept forever in the pantry. What made it special was the chili, which turned a humble pot of corn and scrap meat into something with real depth and fire. Pozole was the food of hard times and the food of feast days at the same time, made for Christmas and for ordinary Tuesdays alike. A little pork went an enormous distance when it was surrounded by all that hominy. For New Mexican families of modest means, this was survival that tasted like celebration. A pot of corn and chili that warmed the cold, high desert nights and cost almost nothing to fill. It remains the sole food of the state. Number 17. Arizona. Frijoles and tortillas. Across Arizona and the whole borderland southwest, the everyday poor man's meal was as simple and as complete as food gets. A bowl of frijoles and a stack of warm tortillas. Pinto beans simmered slow with a little onion, garlic, and maybe a scrap of pork or bacon for flavor, cooked until creamy, then eaten scooped up in a fresh flour or corn tortilla instead of with a fork. Beans and corn together, as the ancient peoples of the region knew, make a complete protein. So a family living on beans and tortillas was nourished far better than the cost of the meal would suggest. A pot of dried beans cost pennies. Tortillas were made from a little masa, or flour, and water, and together they fed a family 3 times a day for almost nothing. The tortilla was the plate, the spoon, and the bread all at once, so there was little to wash. Mashed leftover beans, fried in a pan, became refried beans for the next meal. Nothing wasted. This was the daily bread of the Southwest for centuries, cheap, filling, and quietly perfect in its nutrition. It fed the workers who built the region, one bowl of beans and a warm tortilla at a time. Number 16. Illinois. Poor man's chop suey. Across the Midwest, and especially in Illinois, church basements and farm kitchens, there was a dish everyone called chop suey that had almost nothing to do with any Chinese restaurant. It was ground beef browned with plenty of chopped celery and onion, mixed with rice, a can of cream soup, and a good splash of soy sauce for that hint of the exotic, then baked in a casserole. It was a way to stretch a single pound of ground beef into a filling dinner for a whole family, using cheap celery and cheap rice as the bulk and just enough soy sauce to make it feel like something special. It cost only a little meat and a lot of pantry staples, and it fed potlucks and weeknight suppers across the state. The celery gave it crunch, the rice made it filling, and the cream soup tied it all together into something creamy and comforting. It was Midwestern thrift dressed up in a borrowed name, the same way an earlier generation's goulash had nothing to do with Hungary. Nobody was fooled, and nobody cared, because it was cheap and hot, and there was plenty of it. That was always the point. Number 15. Indiana. Sugar cream pie. Indiana's state pie is a Depression-era miracle, a dessert built for the days when there was no fruit to fill a pie and barely anything in the pantry at all. It is called a desperation pie for a reason. Sugar cream pie is nothing but sugar, flour, cream or milk, butter, and a little vanilla, stirred together and poured into a crust, then baked until it sets into a silky, custard-like filling with a caramelized top. No eggs required, no fruit, no expensive anything, just the humblest staples in the house turned into something that tasted like a celebration. When a farm wife had no apples, no berries, nothing to make a proper pie, she could still put a sweet dessert on the table with what was always on hand. The Quaker and Amish communities of Indiana perfected it. It cost only a little sugar and cream, and it turned a bleak, bare cupboard into a warm slice of comfort. That a poor family could still make something this rich and satisfying out of pantry scraps says everything about the ingenuity of the era. Indiana loved it enough to make it the official state pie. It is proof that even dessert bent to the arithmetic of getting by. Number 14. Massachusetts. Boston baked beans and brown bread. Boston earned the nickname Beantown honestly, because baked beans were the classic thrifty Saturday supper of old New England. Dried navy beans baked low and slow for many hours with a little salt pork and a generous pour of molasses until they turned deep brown, sweet, and tender. Traditionally, they cooked all day Saturday and were eaten Saturday night and cold on Sunday because the strict Puritan Sabbath forbade cooking. So, a pot of beans that fed the family for 2 days without more work was the perfect Sabbath food. The beans cost a dime a pound, the salt pork was a cheap scrap, and the molasses was the cheap sweetener of the day, so the whole crock cost very little and fed a household for a weekend. Served with a slice of steamed brown bread, itself made from cheap cornmeal and rye and more molasses, it was a complete, filling, protein-rich meal. The long, slow bake turned humble beans into something rich and almost meaty. Massachusetts built a whole identity around this pot of beans, a food born equally from poverty and from religion, and it fed the region for 3 centuries on pennies and patience. Number 13. California. Joe's Special. Out in San Francisco, a late-night cook facing an almost empty kitchen threw together ground beef, eggs, spinach, and onion in a single skillet, and Joe's Special was born, a Depression-era dish that turned scraps into a hearty, protein-packed meal. Ground beef browned with onion, a handful of spinach wilted in, then eggs scrambled through the whole thing until it set into a rich, savory hash. It was cheap diner food built for feeding hungry, broke people at any hour, stretching a little beef with cheap eggs and even cheaper greens into a filling plate. The spinach added iron and bulk for almost nothing. The eggs added protein, and the beef gave it substance, all in one pan with almost nothing to wash. For working people and night shift crowds in the Bay Area, it was a complete, satisfying meal for the price of a few eggs and a little meat. It looked humble and tasted rich. The dish spread from a handful of San Francisco joints into home kitchens across California, a perfect example of how the cheapest ingredients, cooked with a little skill, could feed a person well. It is still on menus, a scrappy survivor from the lean years. Number 12. Wyoming. Fried antelope and pan gravy. On the wide, empty ranges of Wyoming, a homestead family did not always have money for beef from the store, but the land was full of pronghorn antelope and mule deer, and a good shot meant the freezer was full for months. Fried antelope steak with pan gravy was the reward. The lean wild meat was sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried fast in hot fat. And then the browned bits left in the pan were turned into a rich milk gravy poured over the top and over a side of potatoes or biscuits. Wild game cost only a bullet and the skill to hunt, so a family that could shoot fed itself on protein that would have cost a fortune at any butcher. The lean meat needed the fat and gravy to stay tender and rich, and a homestead cook knew exactly how to do it. For families 100 miles from the nearest store, hunting was not sport. It was the grocery run, and fried game with gravy was the everyday reward for a successful hunt. It fed the ranch families and homesteaders who settled some of the loneliest country in America, on meat the land provided for free. Number 11. Hawaii. Saimin. In the plantation camps of Hawaii, where laborers came from Japan, China, the Philippines, Portugal, and beyond, all working the cane and pineapple fields for very little, a cheap noodle soup emerged that belonged to everyone and to no one, and they called it saimin. A bowl of thin wheat noodles in a light dashi broth, topped with whatever scraps were cheap and around. Green onion, A little bit of fish cake, maybe a slice of the ever-present canned meat, or a scrap of egg. It was the perfect plantation food, cheap noodles, and a flavorful broth stretching a few pennies of scraps into a hot, slurpable, filling meal. Every ethnic group in the camps added their own touch, and Simon became the shared comfort food of a whole multicultural working class, born from all their kitchens at once. The broth was rich with flavor but poor in cost, and the noodles filled a hungry field worker up for almost nothing. It was the ultimate melting pot poverty food, a dish that could only have been invented by poor people from a dozen cultures cooking side by side. Hawaii still loves Simon, sold everywhere from diners to the local fast food, a warm bowl of its own hard-working history. Fourth pattern break, and this is the one to really sit with. Look back at how many of these came from immigrants and working people who had just arrived with nothing. The Basque herders, the Volga Germans, the Italian tenement families, the plantation workers of Hawaii, the Cornish miners of Michigan. They came to this country with empty pockets and full memories, carrying recipes for feeding a family on almost nothing. And those recipes fed not just them, but the whole regions they settled. Poverty cooking in America is immigrant cooking. It is the food of people who had known hunger somewhere else and were determined never to know it here. Every one of these dishes is a small monument to somebody who arrived with nothing and figured out how to make a home and a hot supper out of the cheapest things the new country offered. We inherited all of it, and then, in our comfort, we forgot where it came from and who it cost so much to make. Number 10. Maine, the saltfish dinner. Down east in Maine, the old Saturday night supper was the saltfish dinner, a plain and hearty meal built entirely around preservation and thrift. Salt cod, soaked overnight to draw out the salt and freshen it, was gently cooked and served over boiled potatoes. All of it topped with a sauce made from onions, fried in salt pork, and a little of the rendered fat, sometimes with hard-boiled egg. Salt cod was one of the cheapest, longest-lasting foods a coastal family could keep, a fish preserved to survive any winter, and dressing it up with potatoes and a salt pork onion gravy turned it into a filling, satisfying meal for very little money. The pork scraps gave richness, the potatoes gave bulk, and the fish gave protein that lasted from the fall catch straight through to spring. For Maine families, this was the taste of the working coast, plain and salty and warming against the cold that came off the water. It cost only the cheap preserved fish and the cellar potatoes, and it fed the fishing families of the state for generations. It is disappearing now, a supper that tasted of salt and thrift and the long Maine winter, made from the fish that kept the coast alive. Number 9. New Hampshire, red flannel hash. Nothing captures Yankee thrift quite like red flannel hash, a meal made entirely from the leftovers of another meal. After a New England boiled dinner, the scraps of corned beef, the leftover potatoes, and crucially the leftover beets were all chopped together and fried in a hot skillet until a deep brown crust formed on the bottom. The beets stained the whole thing a brilliant red, which gave the hash its name, and the frying turned yesterday's leftovers into something crispy, savory, and completely new. It cost nothing at all, because every scrap of it had already been paid for in the previous night's supper. Topped with a fried egg if the hens were laying, it made a complete, hearty breakfast or supper from food that a wasteful kitchen would have thrown away. The crispy edges were the prize, and a good cook knew to press the hash down and let it brown undisturbed. For frugal New Hampshire families, red flannel hash was proof that a meal was not really over until every last scrap had been used a second time. It was the second life of the boiled dinner, and often it tasted even better than the first. Number 8. Oklahoma, fried squirrel and milk gravy. In the hard-hit hill country and the Dust Bowl years of Oklahoma, a family that could hunt would never starve, and small game like squirrel was a genuine dietary staple. Squirrel, cleaned and cut up, was dredged in seasoned flour and fried in a skillet just like chicken. And then the drippings were used to make a rich, peppery milk gravy poured over the meat and over biscuits. It cost only a shotgun shell and the time to hunt, and it put real fried meat on the table for families who could not have afforded chicken or beef from any store. The dark, lean game was flavorful, and the gravy made it rich and stretched it across a plate of biscuits, so it fed everyone. During the Depression and the Dust Bowl, when the crops failed and the money vanished, the woods and fields were the pantry, and squirrel was one of the most reliable things in it. A boy who could hunt was helping feed the family. Fried up crisp with gravy, it tasted like a proper Sunday dinner, even in the leanest years. It fed rural Oklahoma through the worst hard times this country has ever seen, on meat the land provided when nothing else would. Number 7. Tennessee. Fried streak of lean and milk gravy. In the hills of Tennessee, the poor man's bacon was streak of lean, a cheap cut of salt-cured pork side with more fat than meat, streaked through with just a little lean. Sliced and fried crisp in a hot skillet, it rendered its fat and crackled up into salty, chewy strips. And then the drippings became the base for a thick milk gravy, sopped up with biscuits or cornbread. It cost a fraction of what a good ham or proper bacon cost because it was mostly fat. But that fat was exactly what a poor, hard-working body needed for calories and energy. A little streak of lean flavored a whole pan of gravy that could stretch across a family's worth of biscuits. So a few cheap slices of cured pork became a filling breakfast or supper for everyone. The salty, fatty richness against the soft biscuit was deeply satisfying to people burning through calories in the fields. It was survival food built around the cheapest, fattiest scrap of the hog, and Tennessee mountain families lived on it. That gravy, made from almost nothing but fat, flour, and milk, was the taste of getting by in the hills. Number 6. Utah. Lumpy Dick. The Mormon pioneers who settled Utah crossed a brutal desert to build a life on very little, and their poverty cooking was as plain as it gets. Lumpy Dick, an old pioneer dessert supper with an unforgettable name, was made by stirring flour into hot, sweetened milk in a way that deliberately left small lumps, then cooking it into a thick, pudding-like porridge, sometimes seasoned with a little sugar and cinnamon or vinegar. It was practically free, just flour and milk and a little sweetening, the absolute bare minimum a pioneer pantry might hold, turned into something warm and filling that felt like a treat to children who had almost nothing. The lumps were the whole point, little soft dumplings of cooked flour suspended in the sweet milk. For pioneer and early Utah families, this was how you gave the kids a warm, sweet supper when there was nothing else, on ingredients that cost almost nothing and were always on hand. It fed the settlers who irrigated the desert and built a civilization out of dust. It survives now mostly as a curiosity with a funny name, but it was a real supper for real families getting through their first hard winters in a harsh new land. Number 5. North Dakota. Knofle soup. On the frozen northern plains, the German-Russian immigrants who settled North Dakota brought a thick, warming dumpling soup that was practically designed for surviving a merciless winter on almost nothing. Knofle soup starts with tiny hand-rolled dumplings made from just flour, egg, and milk, simmered in a broth with potatoes, onion, and a little cream if the cow was giving. That is nearly the whole thing. A soup made almost entirely of the cheapest staples a farm kitchen held, flour and potatoes stretched into something hearty enough to face a plains blizzard. The little dumplings and the potatoes made it filling and starchy, sticking to the ribs of people who worked outside in unimaginable cold. It cost only flour, potatoes, and a little dairy, and it fed families through winters where the temperature dropped far below zero for weeks at a time. The creamy, dumpling, thick broth was comfort itself against the howling wind outside. Every family had their own way of pinching the dumplings. a skill passed from mother to daughter. Knoifle soup was, and still is, the beloved cold weather food of North Dakota, a bowl of warmth and thrift born on the Russian steppe and perfected in the teeth of the American winter. Number 4. South Carolina. Liver hash over rice. In the low country of South Carolina, when a pig was slaughtered for a barbecue, the organ meat that other people discarded was cooked down into a hash and served over rice. It fed the crowd for almost nothing. Liver, along with other scrap organs and trimmings, was simmered for hours with onions and seasoning until it broke down into a thick, savory, deeply flavored gravy, then ladled generously over a mound of white rice. This was the food that stretched a barbecue to feed everyone, using the parts of the hog that were essentially free, while the good meat was smoked and sold or saved. The rice was cheap and filling, and the rich organ hash flavored the whole plate, so a little of the cheapest meat fed a whole community. Liver is one of the most nutrient-dense foods there is, so the poor families and barbecue crowds eating hash over rice were getting nutrition that money simply could not buy any other way. It is a proud tradition of the Gullah and Low Country table, a whole cuisine built on wasting nothing and making the scraps taste like a feast. Hash over rice fed the working South Carolina table for generations, rich and cheap and unforgettable. Number 3, Mississippi. Cornbread and sorghum molasses. In the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta, where families worked land they would never own and cash almost never touched their hands, supper was very often the plainest thing imaginable. A wedge of hot cornbread with a pour of sorghum molasses over the top. That was the whole meal on countless nights. Cornmeal was ground cheap or came as part of the meager rations, and sorghum was often made right there on the farm by pressing the cane and boiling down the syrup, so the entire supper cost the family next to nothing. The cornbread was hot and filling, and the dark, mineral-rich molasses gave it sweetness and a little iron that a poor diet desperately needed. For sharecropper children, that sweet syrup soaking into the crumbly cornbread was the best part of a very hard day. It was food stripped to the absolute floor of survival. Cornmeal and cane syrup, the two cheapest things the Delta could produce. And yet, it kept families alive and even gave the children a small sweetness to hold on to. This is the meal of the poorest of the poor in the American South. The taste of getting through when there was almost nothing to get through on, and it fed generations who deserved so much more. Number 2, Alaska. Salmon head soup. Far up north, the native peoples of Alaska and the settlers who learned from them understood that when you cleaned a salmon, the head was not garbage. It was some of the richest food the fish had to offer. Salmon head soup was made by simmering the heads, along with any trimmings, in water with a few potatoes and whatever roots or greens were around, until the broth turned rich and golden, with all the oil and gelatin cooked out of the bones and skin. The cheeks and the fat from the head are the most flavorful, most nourishing parts of the whole fish. So a soup made from the scraps everyone else threw away was in truth some of the best eating there was. It cost nothing because the heads were the free leftovers of a catch, and it delivered the fish oils and nutrients that a body needed to survive the long, dark, freezing winters of the far north. In a place where the growing season was short and store food was scarce and expensive, using every part of the salmon was survival itself. Salmon head soup fed the coldest, most remote communities in America on the parts of the fish the rest of the country wasted. Number 1, South Dakota. Fry bread and beans. At the top of this list is a meal born from something much harder than ordinary poverty, and it carries a history every American should know. When native peoples were forced onto reservations across the plains, including the reservations of South Dakota, the government issued them commodity rations: white flour, lard, sugar, salt, powdered milk. Cut off from the foods their ancestors had hunted and gathered for thousands of years, they took those rations and made fry bread, dough fried in hot fat until it puffed golden and crisp. Topped with a pot of beans, or wrapped around them, fry bread and beans became a staple that fed families for generations on almost nothing but the cheapest rationed staples the government gave them. It filled empty bellies, it stretched a little flour and a few beans across many mouths, and it kept families alive through poverty most of the country never saw. But fry bread carries a weight that no other food on this list carries, because it was born from loss, a food invented out of survival when everything else had been taken away. Today, it is beloved and it is complicated, a symbol both of resilience and of everything that was stolen. It fed people through the hardest hunger this country ever inflicted, and it endures as a taste of survival itself. Of all the poor man's meals that fed America, none was made from so little by people who had lost so much, and it still fills a plate today. Here is my challenge. Pick one of these, the one from your state, or the one that made you think of somebody, and actually make it this week. The tomato sandwich, the cornbread and buttermilk, the beans and tortillas. Then tell me in the comments which state you're from and what your grandparents made when money was tight, because every one of these came from a real kitchen and a real family who figured out how to feed the people they loved on almost nothing. That knowledge was never written down. It was just passed along until we stopped needing it and let it slip away. So drop your family's poor man's meal below. Somebody out there is going to read it and remember their own.